My name is Tanya Albornoz, if you don't know me, and I work with the amazing prevention team here at USBE. We welcome all USBE prevention and student services staff to the webinar today. Please wave, team, so everyone can see who you are. Before we get started, we just want to remind you that counting today, we have 3 more webinars left. That's 2 more official webinars and 1 bonus webinar, if you didn't know. May's webinar will explore the Check and Connect mentoring program, which is an attendance-based program, and other effective strategies to improve student attendance, including how mentoring relationships can support engagement and long-term academic success. We also wanted to let you know that we have a bonus webinar, which will be held on April 30th from 12 to 1, that will highlight some of the key state data results from the 2025 administration of the SHARP survey. We'll also look at trends in the data and how the data can be used in prevention efforts. Since this is an add-on webinar, it's a different link to register. You'll have to register separately to participate, and I'll put that registration in the chat after we get started today. Today's topic for our webinar will focus on behavior support basics, and we'll discuss practical evidence-based intervention strategies that can be matched to student needs. Chrisanne Lewis, who is our USBE coordinator for the student services team, will be presenting. She also oversees the USBE behavior support team, if you didn't know we had one. And as always, feel free to put questions and comments in the chat, and we will make sure to address them at the appropriate time. Now I turn it over to you, Chrisanne.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And thanks for pushing our behavior support team. We love to talk to you all about hard students, easy students, fun students. We love to help support, all across the spectrum. So please reach out to us. We love to hear from you. So like Tanya said, today we are going to be talking about behavior basics. Some of this information will likely be a repeat to you, but there is a method in the madness, so hold with us. Hang with us. We'll hopefully present some new information, some information that you may have heard in a different way. As we're going through this, though, I really would like to encourage you to engage in the conversation. This training is really intended to meet your needs, and everyone has different needs. So feel free to ask questions, provide comments, jump in, and we will go ahead and get started. So I'm hoping you all can see my screen. I've just shared. Is that showing through? Okay, perfect. So I wanted to start out by covering just some basic concepts in behavior. All human behavior is learned, no matter what it is, whether it's positive behavior, negative behavior, that behavior has been learned somehow. And if you have challenging behavior in the classroom that is recurring, that means that though that behavior has been reinforced at some point somewhere along the way. And what we're finding is when behavior is being reinforced, most of the time it's being reinforced unintentionally. There is no one out there who wants behaviors to increase in your classroom. There is no person out there that walks into their job at the beginning of the day and says, I wish my kids were dysregulated today. I wish I had to deal with some hard behaviors. But the way that we manage behaviors, as we'll talk through this presentation, can lead to reinforcing behaviors that do end up making our jobs a little bit harder, and that are causing our students to become dysregulated more than we would like. The good news is, though, that if negative behaviors, if challenging behaviors can be taught directly, then those behaviors that we want to see can also be directly taught, and they can also be reinforced. So that's what I try to focus on, is we do have a whole lot of power. We have a lot of power to create the behaviors, to encourage the behaviors that we want to see in our students. One of the other things that I always want to start out with when we talk about behavior is the idea that punishment does not teach new behavior. Punishment has been shown to stop behavior in the short term, and it's pretty good about stopping behavior immediately. So if you think about, if you have a student, for example, who really wants a cookie and their mom has told them they cannot have a cookie, the student climbs up on the counter anyway. They open up the cookie jar and they start eating the cookie. Mom comes in, yells at the kid. What that child has learned is, I don't crawl up on the counter and take a cookie while mom can see me. But they still haven't learned how to get a cookie appropriately. So at some point down the road, they still want a cookie. That's still very reinforcing for them. And so they may try something else. They may try taking the cookie jar into their room and hiding it under their bed. They may try going to their neighbor's house and asking for a cookie. They may go to the store and take a cookie off the shelf because they still have that need. That cookie is still very reinforcing to them. And again, we haven't taught them how to get what it is that they need. So when we use punishment, things like suspension, expulsion, in-school suspension, those are good at stopping behaviors in the moment and keeping students safe, keeping staff safe. But suspension alone and punishment-based interventions are not going to teach those behaviors that we want to see. So they're not going to be effective in the long run. And the behavior change efforts must be data-driven in order to determine effectiveness. As we, in my past, and as we go around to schools, what we see a lot is when there are meetings about student behavior. When a student has behavior that is really challenging, there's a lot of emotion involved, a lot of emotion from the staff that are trying to help with this issue, a lot of emotion with the students, and a lot of times our decisions are emotion-based because of that. And we really need to learn to rely on the data. We need to look at what's actually happening versus what it feels like is happening. And then I think everyone who is on this training has heard the phrase behavior is communication. And as many times as we say it, I think it's worth repeating. Problem behavior occurs for one of two reasons. Either there is a mismatch between the student's needs and their environment, or over time, problem behavior was more heavily reinforced than the appropriate alternative behavior. So the student may not have the skills to do what you're asking them to do. And so they may become dysregulated. They may show challenging behaviors in order to get through the situation, in order to re-regulate, in order to just handle what's being thrown at them. When a student is escalated, their ability to communicate and to plan is reduced. So if you think about, we have our thinking brain and then we have our emotional brain. And when a student becomes dysregulated, their emotional brain kicks in, their thinking brain shuts down. And so all logic, planning, executive function, communication, all of that kind of goes out the window. So when the student is escalated, that's not the time to try to teach them new skills. We need to reduce our language, simplify the language that we're using. We also need to reduce things like sensory stimuli. Because we know that student is just operating purely on emotion at that time. So we need to help them co-regulate. We need to help them to re-regulate in that moment. And we need to recognize whatever behavior that they're engaging in is a form of communication. So as we start out, I want to talk about a student that I saw several years ago. And if any of you have ever been in one of my trainings before, you may have heard this story, but this is one of my favorite students. So I started out working in schools in Texas, and they had a preschool program for students with disabilities. And there was a student named Riley who was in this preschool program. And he was starting to show some really concerning behaviors, lots of physical aggression, lots of defiance. He was starting to run out of the classroom. Sure, y'all have seen kids like this in your setting. So we went into the classroom to do some observations to see if we could help with a functional behavior assessment and then put a behavior intervention plan in place for Riley. And the first time that we went in, these kids were all sitting around a table and they were doing a craft project, some kind of craft. And as we watched, Riley was doing fantastic. He was following directions, he was engaged, he was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing in that moment. The teacher in the classroom, who was amazing, by the way, she had a bell that she would ring to let the kids know that they had 5 minutes left in the task that they were doing. It was her way to indicate a transition was coming. So she rang her bell, and as soon as her bell rang, Riley just froze, and he just sat there at the table, didn't do anything else for the rest of the 5 minutes for that activity. And then at the end of the activity, when the teacher asked the students to clean up and move over to circle time, Riley just sat there. And all the other kids cleaned up, moved over to circle time, and the paraprofessional in the classroom went over and kind of hand over hand helped Riley clean up what he was doing and then helped guide him over to circle time. So as soon as Riley got to circle time, he covered his ears with his hands and he put his head down in his lap and he started rocking. And the kids were singing months of the year, days of the week, I don't know what they were singing, some kind of song. And for those of you who work in early childhood, preschool and kindergarten, into first grade, like our little kids who are singing are adorable. It's amazing, but they are never on tune. It's not melodious. It is not calming. It is not quiet. So Riley made it through about one song before he had reached over and punched the little girl next to him in the face. And the paraprofessional scooped Riley up and took him out into the hallway. They had a chair out there for him, and they sat him down in his chair, and the paraprofessional started rubbing his hands and providing some calming sensory input. And she was talking to Riley, saying things like, we need to use kind hands with our friends. We need to use a quiet voice. So they were out there for about 10 minutes or so until Riley calmed down. And they brought Riley back into the classroom. And by the time they came into the classroom, circle time was over. And they were into center time. And center time just happened to be Riley's very favorite part of the day. He loved trains. So Riley went over to the trains and skipped over, started talking to his friends, happy as a clam, and just went on with his day from there. So I want you to think, and you can put your answers in the chat or you can unmute and you can tell me, I want you to put on your behavior hats. And I want you to start thinking about what could have been the antecedent? What could have been the event that triggered this behavior with Riley? And then once we hear about all of that, we're going to move on to what we saw the next time we saw Riley. Okay, so I'm seeing transitions. I'm seeing lots of responses for transitions. I'm seeing maybe some auditory sensitivity, low frustration tolerance, sensory overload. Perfect. Excellent. Okay, so the next time we went in, self-soothing, I love that. So the next time that we went into the classroom, we purposely went in at the same time because that's when most of the behaviors were occurring. So we went in at that time again, and the kids were all sitting around the table. Again, Riley was doing great. The teacher rang her bell, and this time Riley didn't even make it through the 5 minutes for the transition before he pulled somebody's hair and he was out in the hallway. So now I want you to think through the situation with Riley. How were the staff in the classroom? How did they unintentionally reinforce some of these aggressive behaviors that we were seeing? So removing him from the classroom, escape. I love that you mentioned escape, which is one of our 4 functions of behavior. Taking out of the room for the duration of the non-preferred activity, removing him. So a lot of escape. I'm seeing a lot of we got a sensory reinforcement. Love that. Lots of one-on-one adult attention. Love that. I feel like you guys have seen a Riley at some point in your careers. Excellent. Okay. So we're going to put Riley on pause here. Thanks for engaging with that activity. What I want you to think about right now is that with Riley's behavior, we could have looked at it one of 2 ways. We could have looked at Riley as being intentionally defiant. We could have viewed him as, trying to disrupt the classroom, trying to get in the way of what the teacher was trying to do. Or we can take the lens that he was in distress. There was something in that situation that he was not able to handle. He did not have the skills yet to manage. So Riley was communicating in the way that he knew how. At the point when we did observations with Riley, he was 3 years old and he was pretty verbal, but most 3-year-olds struggle with communication, especially when they are escalated. And Riley was especially escalated. So what we found was in the past with Riley, he had tried lots of different things. He had tried saying stop. He had tried yelling. He had tried saying he didn't like it. And the response to all of those attempts at communication was, it's okay, Riley, you can still do it. And Riley learned pretty quickly that the fastest way to get out of a situation that he did not have the skills to handle was to hurt someone. As soon as he did that, he was able to get out of that situation. And again, we'll talk about some of the other reinforcers here in a second. So we want to move into the 4 functions of behavior. So escape, attention, tangible, and sensory. Escape really serves to get a child or an individual out of a situation that they don't have the skills to manage, or that cause some sort of discomfort, some sort of anxiety. Attention really serves to get attention from peers, from adults, from someone else in the environment. And for those of you who work with older students, there's a very interesting change that starts to happen about the middle of elementary school, maybe into late elementary school, where our younger kids really prefer attention from adults, and they really want that positive reinforcement. They want to engage with adults. And as they start to get a little bit older, that changes, and they start to value attention from peers more than they value the attention from the adults. And at that point, and for a lot of our kids throughout their life cycle, any attention is great, whether it's negative attention, positive attention. So even if this is a high school student and they make a comment in class and everybody laughs, that is still positive, that's still attention for them. And that for that student, that may be very reinforcing to get just that reaction from their peers, even if their peers end up laughing at them. And then tangible is anything that you can hold. So it's a snack, it's an iPad, it's a toy, it's a game, it's anything that student can interact with and can hold. And sensory, and for those of you who are unaware, I'm an occupational therapist. So the sensory is where I live. And sensory, really what that means is there's some sort of internal sensation that they are uncomfortable with. So it could be that the child is oversensitive to noise. It could be that they're hungry. It could be that their stomach hurts. It could be a combination of all of those, but they're trying to get some sort of sensory need met. Now, the fun thing about behavior is that our kids very, very rarely fall into just one category. So let's think about Riley again and bring him back. I saw in the chat that we had some people had responded, he may have an escape maintain behavior. He could be seeking attention. He could be trying to escape some sensory information. Are there any other thoughts that you have regarding Riley as far as the function of his behavior? Dysregulation on a neurological level. Thanks, Franny. Thanks for putting that in there. That would fall under the sensory. It could also fall under escape. And I'm so glad that you made that comment, because it kind of leads into my next point, that a lot of this overlaps. So if you have a student who maybe is oversensitive to noise, that is a sensory behavior, but it is maintained by escape. So the student is trying to escape, get out of that situation where they are overwhelmed by that auditory information. So with Riley, we saw lots of reinforcement. We saw that he was able to escape the loud noises that came with the circle time. Once he got into the hallway, he was able to get attention from a preferred adult. I always forget to mention this when I'm telling the story, but that paraprofessional happened to be his favorite human being on the planet. So he got one-on-one attention from a preferred adult, and he got calming sensory input. So the sensory input from the classroom was reduced, and the paraprofessional did a really great job of helping him to regulate. And then once he went back into the classroom, he was rewarded with one of his favorite activities, which was center time and the trains. So while the staff members in this classroom, they were fantastic staff members, in a lot of ways, they did everything right. Unintentionally, over time, they reinforced this behavior that Riley was only able to get his needs met by hurting someone. That was the quickest, easiest way to get what he needed. And then I want to touch on, before we start getting into some of the meat of this, I want to touch base, or I want to have a discussion about can't versus won't. So when we talk about a student won't do their homework, a student won't sit in their seat, a student won't raise their hand before speaking out in class, it implies that the student has some sort of premeditation. They've thought this through. They are intending to be disruptive or be defiant, and it's deliberate behavior. So this is assuming that the child has all the tools or all of the skills, but they refuse to use them. And I would argue that very, very few kids fall into this category. What we see more often is the can't. The student, that when we talk about how a student can't maybe raise their hand before speaking out, it acknowledges that the child may not have the skills to do that. They may not have had the training. They may not have the knowledge to perform the skill in that specific situation. And it might be that the child is able to do that in one setting, but is not able to do that in another setting. So, for example, if they're in a small group environment that is very structured, then they're able to stay in their seat, they're able to attend, they're able to focus. But if there's a lot of sensory information going on in the environment, if it's a task that they're very anxious about, then they are not able to perform the task in that moment. And one example of this is an experience that I had. So I, several years ago, was in Oakland, California, and it was an area that I did not know very well, and I ended up getting lost. We had GPS trying to get us from Oakland across the Bay Bridge into San Francisco. And for some reason, GPS kept telling me to go on a road that was taking me directly into the water, and I did not want to drive through the water to get to San Francisco. And I had my kids in the back seat, and I had the radio playing. And at some point in this situation, I had to turn off the radio. I had to tell my kids to be quiet, all so that I could see in order to drive. And I have developed over the years, I'm a pretty functional adult driver. I know how to drive. I can drive through many situations. But in that situation, I literally could not drive given the anxiety, the stress, the sensory input, the situation that was happening. And I'm sure a lot of you can identify situations where that's happened to you. And it's the same with our kids. They get in situations where maybe they could do it this morning, but this afternoon, they are not able to do their math for a number of different reasons. I'm going to go through this slide really quickly, but I just want to make you aware that this is something that we have here at USBE called our Classroom Management Self-Assessment. And as you're looking at behavior supports in your classroom, this is a really, really great way to start and a really great way to gather data about the practices in your classroom. I want to be clear that I would never use this as a performance evaluation. So if you're an administrator, please don't use this to evaluate, your teachers in the classroom. What this is intended for is for educators to look at their own practices, their own setting, identify areas where they're doing really, really well, and then identify maybe one or two areas where they could improve. And they can make goals based off of this data. And I would recommend doing this a couple of times a year on your own classroom. It doesn't take very long to do it, but again, it really helps you to objectively look at what are the things that need to be in place in order to support behaviors in my classroom. All right, and moving on, I am a huge fan of the crisis cycle. And I hope all of you have heard or seen some version of this crisis cycle in your experience. But what this does is it allows us to evaluate objectively where a student is, where their behavior falls in this crisis cycle, and then match our response to that student's behavior. Without this, what tends to happen is that we may try to match an inappropriate response to a student behavior. So for example, we may overreact when a student is, maybe in escalation begins, or we may not provide the appropriate supports when the student is more escalated. So for example, in crisis peak or escalation intensifies. And as we go through these, we are going to break it down by what does a student look like when they're in each of these phases? And then what is the appropriate response based off of that student behavior? So the first stage in the crisis cycle is baseline. And this is where the student is regulated. The student is engaged. They are demonstrating positive behaviors. they are doing what you want them to do in this phase. This is where, this is the only phase where we want to teach students and to introduce new concepts to them, introduce skills. The reason for this is because this is where the student is still, their thinking brain, their frontal lobe is still engaged, and they are able to engage in learning. So at this stage, we're reinforcing the behaviors that we want to see. We are specifically teaching skills and behaviors that we want to see in the future. This is where we're going to teach coping strategies. So for example, deep breathing. We are going to teach alternative behaviors, and we're going to practice those behaviors. Practice, practice, practice. So if a student is struggling to, line up appropriately and walk down the hallway, then we're going to practice lining up appropriately and walking down the hallway. Just like we would practice, multiplication skills, or we would practice vocabulary words. We have to teach directly and practice each of these behavioral skills in order for them to be internalized. As an OT, one of the most common things that I hear when kids start to get into maybe later elementary, middle school, and into high school is deep breathing is one of the most basic, one of the most effective strategies that we can use for regulation with our kids. But I hear a lot from kids when I'm like, okay, let's learn deep breathing. Almost always at that age, they're like, I have done deep breathing since I was 2 years old. It doesn't work. It never helps. I hate deep breathing. And part of the reason for that, this is my own theory, I don't have any research to support this, but part of the reason why I think this happens is that when the student becomes escalated, the first thing that we do is say, okay, let's start deep breathing. This creates an association within the student's brain between those escalated emotions, so anxiety, anger, frustration, and this coping strategy. So you now have an association between deep breathing, negative emotions. So when you practice deep breathing, the student automatically goes to their central nervous system, takes them straight to anxiety, frustration, anger, and some of those more challenging emotions. It's just like when you were in high school, you probably had a song that you associate with an event, and deep breathing becomes associated with those dysregulating events. So we need to practice, if we're using deep breathing as the example, we need to practice deep breathing when the student is calm so that they associate deep breathing with being calm, with being regulated. And we need to reinforce every time that the student practices deep breathing. They should be able to practice whatever coping strategy that we're teaching them. They should be able to do it in their sleep on a moment's notice so that when they start to become dysregulated, this strategy, we're 100% sure that they know how to do it. And second, this is the first thing that they go to when they start to become dysregulated. And it's not becoming associated with negative emotions and dysregulation, excuse me. So our adult responses in baseline, again, reinforce those positive behaviors, ensure that the student's basic needs are met. If this is a student, that maybe is not eating at home, let's ensure that they have access to food at school. Let's make sure that they've used the restroom. Let's make sure that, they're feeling okay, that they're not feeling sick that day. This is the time, this is where most of our interaction should happen, is in baseline. So if you have a student who doesn't want to try deep breathing even when calm, I would look at some different coping strategies. This is probably a student, for whatever reason, who is either associating that deep breathing with negative experiences, or deep breathing is just not a strategy that's going to work for them. It doesn't work for everybody. So I personally would not fight that battle, and I would see if we could find something else. It might be movement. You might have a movement-based coping strategy. It might be counting. There's 100 different regulating activities that are out there. And I would not fight the student on that. I feel like there's enough other options that you have that it's not worth fighting that battle with them. All right, so support or prevention strategies, that happen during baseline. this is where we really want our prevention efforts to go. You can't prevent a behavior after it's already happened. And so we really want to focus on making sure that we're putting in place some of these strategies prior to that behavior. So again, we're supporting problem solving, we're supporting self-advocacy. One of my favorite things to do, especially with kids who again are a little bit older, is to have them practice strategies in their mind. So what I tell the kids is I want you to think about lunch. I want you to think about what happens at lunch. Picture it all in your mind. What are the smells? What are the sights? What are the sounds that happens when you go to lunch? Now I want you to think about, you start to get very overwhelmed because it's really, really loud in the lunchroom. What are you going to do? And have them run through that in their mind. There's a lot of research that's showing that mental rehearsal of those behaviors is just as effective as the physical rehearsal of behaviors. So you don't actually have to walk down to the lunchroom, be in that environment in order to practice those skills. Break down activities into manageable chunks, utilize checklists and visual aids, predictable routines and expectations. I cannot emphasize enough the value of this. If the student knows what's going to happen, you can prevent a lot of behaviors. Develop predetermined consequences. The student should know ahead of time. Every student in your classroom should be able to tell you, if I do this, this is what's going to happen. If I get out of my seat when I'm not supposed to, then the teacher is going to put in place, this, whatever the strategy is. And the teacher is going to ask me twice to sit down, and then I may lose a privilege, or whatever it might be. And then provide choice when possible. The reason for this is when our students start to become dysregulated, when anyone starts to become dysregulated, they start to feel very out of control. They feel a lack of control over their environment, and providing these choices is a way that they can regain control over what's happening to them. And we'll talk more about this here in a minute, but just to kind of introduce that idea. And then the last thing I want to talk about as we are having this conversation is the value of teaching self-advocacy. As adults, so we want to prepare our kids to go out into the world and do whatever it is that they're going to do after they leave us, after high school or after post-graduation. And self-advocacy, I would argue, is the most important skill. If you have a student who leaves us and is able to walk into a work setting and say, whoever their boss is, Mr. Boss, Mrs. Boss, can I please wear noise-canceling headphones while I'm cooking this hamburger at McDonald's, or while I'm doing whatever it is that I need to do? Mr. or Mrs. Boss, I don't understand what you are telling me. Can you please explain it in a different way? If our student is able to advocate for themselves in that way, then they are going to be successful in pretty much anything that they are wanting to do. In addition, you want to reinforce positive choices and reinforce effort. Even if the child is not 100% successful in what it is that they're trying to do, reinforce that effort. Tell them, I'm so glad that you gave this a shot. I know that it's really hard for you. Thanks for trying. You want to provide visual supports, delay and distract, especially with our little ones. What I love the most about our little kids is that they fully advertise their interest and their preferences. They have an Elsa t-shirt, or they've got, superheroes on their shoes. So you automatically, with most of our kids, you know what it is that they like. And so you can walk up to your first grader who's becoming dysregulated and say something like, hey, I was finally able to watch Frozen 2 last night. Do you remember what Elsa did when whatever this happened? And all of a sudden that student their attention is drawn away from whatever is frustrating them into something that is preferred. And it's really easy to distract. And I say this in a loving way. Our little kids, their attention span is about 2 seconds. And so it's really, really easy to distract them and onto something that is more preferred and more positive. And then schedule movement opportunities. I can't emphasize this enough. Our kids need to move. I have been attending a conference. I happen to be coming to you from sunny 85-degree South Carolina right now from a conference. And it has been really hard for me to sit all day long in a lot of these sessions because typically I'm up and moving around. I have a standing desk at work, and our kids are the same way. You know, if we, especially our little kids, they need movement about every 20 minutes in order to maintain attention. So build those movement opportunities into your day, into what it is you're already doing. Calm down spaces, we'll talk about those here in a second, and then incorporate sensory supports as needed. We're going to go ahead and skip through this one just in the sake of time. But the only point I want to make here is that we want to make sure that our classrooms are emotionally safe for our students, that they are able to feel like they can take risks without getting in trouble, that they have a safe place to land if they happen to fail. Again, I think about in my life, in my work, I am a lot more likely to take risks when I know that the people around me are going to support me if it doesn't go okay. If my team is going to rally around me, if I, try a certain training or try to do a strategy and it just fails, they're going to help me identify what happened and they're going to help pick me up. And our kids are the same way. So one of the hardest things to teach, in my opinion, is self-regulation. So self-regulation is very, very complex, and it involves lots of different steps. And a lot of us, again, as an OT, I use zones of regulation. I use lots of different programs to teach self-regulation. But I hear a lot from people, the kid is able to identify what zone they're in. They're able to tell me what to do when they are regulated. But when they are dysregulated, they are not able to use the skill that they have. And this visual that I have here, it's from an OT named Kelly Mahler, and she does a lot of work on what's called interoception, and that is your body's internal sense of just senses within your body. So whether you're hungry, sick, you have to use the restroom. She does a lot of research on that. And so this is her theory about self-regulation, that the first step is we have to notice a sensation. We have to notice that something is coming in. So if we take the example of Riley, he was dysregulated by sound. Let's make it simple. He was dysregulated by sound. So he noticed in his internal system that his heart rate started beating faster. His muscles started to tense up. He started to feel a little bit hot. Then Riley has to take those body clues, as I call them, and he has to give them meaning. So he has to be able to recognize when my heart beats fast, when my muscles are tense, that means I'm angry or I'm frustrated. Then he has to have an urge to act. So he has to be able to make a plan. So I'm going to raise my hand and say, I need a break, or I'm going to hit the kid next to me. And then they have to engage in that action. So in Riley's case, hitting the girl next to him, and then there is some kind of outcome. So in Riley's case, by hitting the little girl next to him, his discomfort faded, just like it says on the slide. So he was able to regulate his internal system. His heart rate slowed down, his breathing slowed down, his muscles relaxed. So he got a huge payoff for that action that he engaged in. What we find from adults who have autism is that they've told us that they struggle a lot with associating this interoception, these senses from their internal systems, with emotions. So they may recognize that their stomach feels differently, that their muscles are starting to get tight, but they are not able to identify, does that mean that I'm excited and really happy for this concert that I'm going to be going to over the weekend? Or does this mean that I'm really angry and I'm anxious about, this job interview that I have on Friday? So we need to help those kids pair those senses with the emotions that come prior to even trying to teach self-regulation with our students. So some suggestions for teaching self-regulation. Social stories work really, really great. There's a lot of good research behind social stories, and those can be written social stories. Those can be video social stories. They're all effective in their own way. And then one of the next ones is break cards. So when you have a student who starts to become dysregulated, allow them to take a certain number of breaks. And I could do a whole day of training just on break cards and targeted breaks. But they do work as long as the student knows what to expect on the break and as long as their communication efforts are recognized. One of the pushbacks that I get a lot from teachers is if I allow my student to take breaks whenever they want, they're going to start to take breaks when there's a math test or when I need them to do independent reading. They're going to start to take breaks during all of those situations that are hard. And what we have found and what research shows is that if the breaks include something that is regulating but not necessarily reinforcing. So for example, they're able to go to the hallway and get a drink of water, but not go to the counselor's office and play with Legos for 30 minutes. Then they start to be able to advocate for what they need. They're using those coping strategies during those breaks instead of those preferred activities reinforcing escaping from those activities that they don't want to participate in.
19, 20.
So we have stress thermometers are also one, and I can't remember if I put a picture in here. I did not. Stress thermometers are a really good way to work with some of our older kids. And I would probably wait until kids are about 5th, 6th grade and up before using this. But basically, it's a thermometer. On the left-hand side, you label different emotional states. And then you talk about the body clues for each of those different emotions. So for example, anxiety, again, your muscles are getting tense and so on. And then on the right-hand side, you're identifying strategies that the student can use when they are in that state. And then there's a lot of really good programs like the How Does Your Engine Run program, Zones of Regulation. This is a really good visual that I took a picture in a classroom of a teacher that was using the How Does Your Engine Run program. This teaches kids to associate their emotions with the Winnie the Pooh character. So again, when you think about Tigger, you know what that looks like. These are the kids that are bouncy, bouncy, bouncy. They are all over the place. These are the kids that are dysregulated because their emotions are heightened. And then you have Winnie the Pooh, which is in that optimal zone. And then you have Eeyore, who is lethargic, who is disengaged, who's sad, who's depressed. And once we can teach the kids again to associate that with their emotions, then we can teach them what to do about it. The second stage in the crisis cycle is catalyst. And this is where something has gone wrong. Something has happened that is starting to generate anxiety, that is starting to cause the student to become dysregulated. The fun thing about this is it's not always predictable or obvious. It could be anything in the environment that is causing the student to become dysregulated. I had a student several years ago that just hated the tone of my voice. And so as soon as I started speaking, he was done. And so in that case, the catalyst was the tone of my voice. Another fun thing is that this catalyst might change from day to day. So if you have a student who has slept well, who ate a good breakfast, they had a good experience coming into class that morning, they are going to be able to handle a lot more. Their nervous system is going to be able to handle a lot more than a student who didn't take their medication. They didn't sleep the night before. They got in a fight with their mom or their brother and sister on the way to school. So they're already feeling dysregulated. It was really interesting. I was in a session this morning at my conference, and I loved the way that the presenter put this. He said that he often hears this kid went from 0 to 60, just like that. And for some kids, they start out at 0 miles per hour, and other kids, they're coming into you at 55 miles an hour already. And so it doesn't take much to send them to that 0 to 60, to send them over that edge. So our response at Catalyst is to respond in a supportive manner. At this stage, at this phase, it's okay to negotiate with the student. It's okay to say something like, you know what, I asked you to write 10 spelling words, and I see that's really hard for you. Can I help you get started? Or if you're doing a math worksheet, let's work on the first problem together. For every problem that you finish, I'm going to let you put an X on another problem so they can kind of work to get out of work. You want to acknowledge whatever's going on, honor and respect whatever has caused that student to become dysregulated, even if you think in your mind that that is completely ridiculous. If you have a student whose catalyst is they broke their pencil, that is not the end of the world to most of us, but for that student in that moment, it may feel like the end of the world to them that they broke their pencil. And so we want to offer that that respect, that acknowledgement that this is a really difficult situation, and then help them identify strategies to move forward, co-regulate with them. So our supportive responses build trust over time. And as we build trust, the students learn that they can come to us. We are a person that's going to help them when they need assistance, when they are stressed. It teaches them a sense of self-control, and it teaches the students to advocate for themselves. It teaches them how to get what they need in an appropriate way. So if you can teach them to problem solve through this math worksheet that is really, really hard, and to ask for what they need, this is too hard, I'm not able to do it, can you please help me? Then down the road, they're going to be able to get what they need when the situations get even harder. All right. So the next stage is escalation begins. This is when typically we start to notice some sort of change in the student's behavior. And that change can be pretty subtle, or it can be obvious. So if you have a student who's typically pretty chatty, then it might be that student all of a sudden gets really quiet. Or if you have a student who's really quiet, all of a sudden you start to see them making noise or become really chatty, start to ask a lot of questions. So it's really important that you know what your student's baseline looks like so that you can identify when they start to get into this stage, when they start to escalate. And it could be, the externalizing behaviors are a lot more obvious than those internalizing behaviors. So you want to make sure that you're paying attention to that as well. Some of our really quiet kids, they are equally as deserving of our attention and our support as some of the kids who are throwing things off of desks or disrupting the classroom in a more obvious way. So our responses in escalation begins. We support the student through the problem solving, validate their experience, even if we don't agree that it's a really, really difficult experience. We still want to validate it. Redirect them to pre-taught coping or self-regulation strategies, and then redirect them to an already mastered skill, which we talked about. The last thing on here, actually a couple of things. So I want to talk about the value of behavior momentum. So this is that second bullet point where the third bullet point, where we redirect them to an already mastered skill. So for some of my kids, when they start to become dysregulated, when their escalation begins, I will back all the way up to, hey, can you count to 5 for me? Or even touch your nose, touch your head. And then providing a lot of reinforcement for that compliance at that level. Once they experience that success, they are much more likely then to move forward and to participate in some of those more difficult activities that we're asking them to participate in. Fail-safe choices, those are choices that are okay with you, no matter what the student chooses, but it gives them that sense of control back in their environment. So for example, you might tell the student, we've got to write your spelling words, but do you want to use a marker or do you want to use a pencil? Do you want to talk about this in the classroom right now, or should we go out into the hallway? Do you want to sit here, or do you want to go sit with your friends? In every situation, there's almost always a choice that we can offer the student to give them back some of that control. And then phrasing expectations positively. So instead of telling them what not to do, we want to tell them what to do. So instead of saying, stop jumping on your chair, we are telling them, I need you to sit in your chair. Because when we say to a student, don't stop jumping on your chair, we assume that they know what to do instead. We assume that they know that means I need to sit down in my chair and have a calm body. We cannot assume that with our students. So we need to teach them, I need you to sit down in your chair, and this is what it looks like. We have escalation intensifies, and this is where the behavior starts to get really, really big if we can't interrupt it in one of those earlier stages. So the student might curse, they might throw things, they might be yelling, they might try to leave the classroom, they might completely shut down. At this stage, their thinking brain is already shut down. So they have reduced language processing and increased sensory sensitivity. So our responses are to limit our communication. So if we have to speak to them, if we have to give them directions, we're going to make it very simple. We're going to lower our voice level, model what we want to see. We want to make sure that we remain calm. A dysregulated adult is never going to help a dysregulated student to calm down. We want to avoid taking behaviors personally, get assistance as needed, and then set those limits. If you sit down, then I'm able to help you. When you write your name on your paper, then you can line up to go to recess. And this is the stage where you want to avoid negotiation and you want to avoid arguing. If you engage in negotiation at this stage, you will likely unintentionally reinforce the behavior that you don't want to see, because the student learns, I have to escalate to this point before my teacher is going to listen to what I need or respond to what I need in that moment. You want to support the basic needs of the student. So again, reduce that sensory stimulation, remove the audience if needed, and then maintain respect for the student. No matter how ridiculous you think it is that they're acting this way, we are not communicating that to the student. We are honoring, validating their experience, and then helping them to problem solve through this situation. And then I do want to emphasize at Escalation Intensifies, these behaviors look and they feel really big, but this is not the stage where we are going to use emergency safety interventions. The student is not an immediate danger to themselves or others at this stage, so we are going to use some of our other strategies. So in my previous life, previous to USBE, I was a trainer for the Nonviolent Crisis Intervention, which is, a lot of you know, as NCI or CPI. And one of the things that I loved, that I emphasized the most in this training, is this escalation continuum. So in this Escalation Intensifies, there are typically 3 behaviors that we see. So questioning, refusal, release, intimidation, and tension reduction. Our goal is tension reduction. But this program, NCI, really outlines very clearly what you do at each of these other stages. So with questioning, there are 2 types of questions. There's an information-seeking question and a challenging question. An information-seeking question is anything that you can answer with a logical response, even if it doesn't sound like a logical question. So for example, the student might be like, why do I have to do this? Or they might say that it just might be as simple as, when is recess? When is lunch? And in that case, you're going to provide a rational response. If you can provide a rational response, do it. A challenging question is one that cannot be answered with a rational response. So an example of this might be, who gave you the right to tell me what to do? And your response could be, well, I went to 4 years of college, I graduated, I got my licensure through the Utah State Board of Education, I was hired by the principal. None of those are going to be what the response the student is looking for. So in that moment, you are going to downplay the topic and set limits. So go back to those if then, when then, set boundaries, and then stick to the topic. The best response in this case is just, you know what, go ahead and write your name on your paper, or okay, remember we're finishing math. Just redirect the student back to whatever it is that you're doing. And then with refusal, this is any kind of noncompliance. You're setting limits, and then you are redirecting the student back to that task. With refusal, one of the things that's especially effective here is those fail-safe choices. So keep that in mind. If you see refusal, one of the first things I go to is that choice. And then release. This is a verbal and emotional outburst. This is big behavior. And in this case, the response is allow venting, remove the audience. And then intimidation. This is one of my favorite stages because this is where you get to see all sorts of fun personalities from our students. But this is where you have verbal or nonverbal threats. And in this case, you are taking the threat seriously and you are seeking assistance. I have learned through this training, this nonviolent crisis intervention, just the value of okay. As satisfying as it is to win an argument with a second grader, it works so much better just to say, okay, we're still working on math, and just don't even engage. Don't let yourself get sucked into that power struggle. We've talked about limit setting a lot, so I'm going to skip through these. You will have the slides later that you can read through. Just for the sake of time, we're going to skip through this. Move on to crisis peak. So crisis peak, this is where you might use emergency safety interventions. The student's behavior may appear irrational. You might see physical aggression, property destruction. This is where the student really has very little control over their actions. Their amygdala has been fully activated at this point. So with crisis peak, you are remaining calm and consistent. Interact with the student only when needed. Any kind of interaction is likely going to continue to escalate the student. So reduce your language. If you have to give them directions, just make it as simple as possible. Even better than having verbal directions is to have some kind of visual that you can point to. So if you want the student to sit down, just have a picture of someone sitting down and just continue to point to that as you need to. An important point here is that you also want to avoid communicating with other people. So this student is in an emotional crisis at that moment. And if they hear you talking about them or even anything else in that moment, they are going to assume that you are saying something negative about them, and it's going to continue to de-escalate. So don't talk to other people if you don't have to. Remove as many people as you can from the room while still maintaining safety. Remove sensory stimulation. Maintain a safe physical distance so that you're keeping yourself safe. Pay attention to things like posture. And then ensure that your responses are reasonable and proportionate. So this is not the time to tell the student, if you don't calm down, you are never going to get another McDonald's chicken nugget for the rest of your life. Like, that's not reasonable, not proportionate to that situation. All right, de-escalation. So this is where the student is starting to calm down, but they are at, if we're taking the analogy of 0 to 60, they are still at 59 miles per hour. So it would be really easy for them to re-escalate. Our adult responses are rebuilding trust. You are still reducing any kind of communication or sensory input. You're not making demands, and we are not talking about any kind of restoration or anything that they need to do to fix the situation at this stage. We're going to skip through a lot of this. We have 3 minutes. We're going to get through it. And then the next stage is exhaustion. So this is where the student might be drained, especially if they've hit that crisis peak stage. Then they're probably going to be hungry, tired. So we need to make sure that we're getting their basic needs met at this point. This is where you are going to, again, rebuild trust with that student, let them know that they are still, your relationship is still okay. Check in with staff to make sure they are okay. Staff might need a break. And then return control to the student if you can. Recovery. This is the very end. This is where the student is ready to move back into class. At this point, this is where you are going to start to talk about how they're going to repair harm, how they're going to restore the environment, maintain confidentiality at this point, and then start to problem solve future expectations and future responses. I want to end with some resources. Again, you'll have these slides later, but all of these are hyperlinks to resources that we have here within USBE. So if you are looking for more information on behavior management, this is a really, really great place to start. I purposely included our trauma sensitive schools courses as our top resource here, because a lot of our kids are engaging in some of these challenging behaviors because of past trauma. So pay attention to that. And then my contact information is on the last slide. Feel free to reach out to me with any additional questions that you have, or, just to let me know if you tried some of these strategies, if they worked or didn't work. Again, I love hearing from all of you. I love hearing about your experiences and your students. So please reach out. And we made it just before 1 o'clock.
Good job, Kristan. Thank you for such an excellent overview of behavior and such excellent recommendations for strategies to help. Quick reminder one more time, join us for April 30th for our webinar that focuses on SHARP. And next month is focusing on Check and Connect, mentoring, and attendance interventions. We hope to see you then on April 30th and May 21st. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon.